Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Stevens, and this is the Psychology to Live By podcast. Today's podcast is about building character and exploring its relationship with personality. But isn't character the same thing as personality? Well, that's a common misapprehension. They're different, and the difference is that personality traits are something you're born with, whereas character traits are something that you build. And why do we need to build character? Well, the answer is there's no such thing as a perfect personality or a perfect personality environment fit. We are all, in various ways, maladapted to our dynamically changing circumstances. Our personality predisposes us in very deep ways, some adaptive, some maladaptive. In any case, evolutionary adaptation is about passing on genes, not about well-being or happiness per se. Building character, on the other hand, is all about flourishing. Now, where our personality is maladaptive, usually we, and those around us, suffer. I'll argue in this podcast that the sole purpose for character development and the moral imperative that development entails is to increase human flourishing. And because of our deeply and inherently social nature, that flourishing includes not just me, but those around me. Take, for instance, a person who scores very highly on agreeableness. They will tend to systematically underestimate their own needs and sacrifice themselves to appease others. This likely means they'll be pretty unhappy, as their legitimate needs will not be getting met. And as they eventually realise this, they come to suffer from the twin poisons of resentment and righteousness. And all that sacrifice will probably still not garner respect from others. Or take the person who's extremely extroverted, who naturally dominates meetings and discussions, and whose energy can exhaust those around them. Eventually, this will negatively impact their relationships with a significant number of people who yearn for them to shut up for a change, or who feel unheard and unrespected. Now, in realising this, the extroverted person needs to recalibrate in the direction of introversion for these specific contexts. We could multiply these examples for all the personality traits, but you get the idea. Through life and life experiences, ideally we will recalibrate these extremes where that's the wise thing to do in terms of collective flourishing. And that's character development. Now, what I mean by character is our moral orientation to the world, that which will produce mutual flourishing. So I guess that means I really want to focus mainly on building a good character, though it's very important to note that people can also develop bad characters. And this immediately raises the question of what a good or bad character is. Isn't this entirely in the eye of the beholder? Isn't it completely subjective? And is it not perfectly captured by the popular and, in my less than humble opinion, utterly inane meme, "You do you and I'll do me"? Well, no. It's not only about my subjective well-being. Wisdom dictates that my flourishing must not negatively impact on those around me. But more on that later. Finally, why is a psychologist like me getting into these seemingly treacherous religious or philosophical waters? Isn't it outside the purview of a psychological science? Well, the reason's simple. Character and morality are not, in my view, completely subjective or relative. They can be studied scientifically and are extremely important in human flourishing, which is an absolute central concern of psychology. So first, some history. For a long time, psychology distanced itself from anything that even risked appearing to be non-scientific, especially about moral values or character. It focused on cognition, behaviours and emotions, especially clinical disorders, and carefully avoided anything that looked like invisible inner traits, such as character. So character and morality were off limits. The last thing we wanted to be accused of was imposing subjective values onto someone else in an unscientific manner. Well, fortunately, those self-limiting days are long gone. Moral psychology is now a thing. This started with Piaget, who demonstrated the developmental stages of moral reasoning. He was followed by Kohlberg's theory of moral development, and then the rise of moral psychology per se. For example, Jonathan Haidt's explorations of moral intuitions as shaped by both evolution and by culture. And finally, it was positive psychology that largely reintroduced the idea of ethics into psychological study, especially via the application of character strengths and character virtues, which are capabilities expressive of a person's character. And all this had been extended by more recent neuroscience, cross-cultural psychology, and evolutionary psychology. It's now a thriving subfield, highly pertinent to well-being and psychological flourishing. And an important question, does good character lead to more flourishing? Yes. Acting with good character improves our inner life. We experience less guilt, more self-respect, and greater psychological resilience. Generosity and compassion boost happiness and reduce stress, literally benefiting one's physical health. And in both professional and everyday life, integrity and fairness are the basis for most long-term success. So, now we understand how valuable it is, let's get to understanding character development. And I want to focus on just two perspectives on building character. One based on moral realism and one based on an evolutionary perspective. So first to moral realism. I highly recommend Sam Harris's 2010 book, The Moral Landscape. Harris argues that morality should be grounded in science, not religion or pure relativism. The solid ground for morality is that just as there are objective facts about human health, there are objective facts about human well-being. And morality is about moving towards states of greater well-being and flourishing for conscious beings such as us. If you think about it, this is a purpose that drives us all, and there are right and wrong ways to go about it. In other words, behaviours that cause suffering for others, such as violence, cruelty, deception, and so on, are morally bad. Behaviours that increase our own flourishing and that of others are morally good. There are potentially an infinite number of ways to be morally good, but there are equally identifiably wrong ways to go about it. So, for example, it's the sign of a bad character to tell lies for personal gain or to rob people. Obviously, this makes other people suffer. But also, it means we, the liar or the robber, are deprived of authentic, loving relationships. And we're having to carry the ongoing burden of lying, constantly fearing discovery, suffering the lack of authenticity, and so on. And when people discover our malfeasance, they will badmouth us, perhaps even attack us. We may lose our liberty and end up in jail. Crucially then, my flourishing should also bring well-being to others. Why is that? Because our lives are deeply interconnected. Others' suffering spills into our lives through violence, instability, broken trust, and lack of cooperation. If we ignore others' well-being, we eventually undermine our own. And in this sense, compassion and moral concern are not just altruistic, they're a form of enlightened self-interest. And developing positive character traits or virtues can be guided by this enlightened self-interest. So the other perspective on the psychology of character development is evolutionary theory. And here I make reference to Robert Wright's wonderful book, The Moral Animal. in which Wright argues that human morality is not an accident of culture or religion, but a product of natural selection. Our ancestors survived and reproduced more successfully when they could cooperate, form alliances, and regulate conflict. So this means that our moral instincts such as fairness, guilt, gratitude, outrage at cheating, these are universal, deeply hardwired tendencies that help groups function and individuals thrive within them. So according to evolutionary psychology, we're predisposed to help others when there's a chance they'll help us back. So this is called reciprocal altruism for obvious reasons, and emotions like gratitude and friendship encourage reciprocity, while anger and resentment discourage cooperation and lead to win-lose relationships, sometimes lose-lose relationships. So natural selection had already favoured altruism towards our kin, since they carry our genes. But in humans, this really expanded to friends or groups, and especially in the context of tribal living, where cooperation was absolutely essential. Our sense of duty, shame, and honour all reflect these evolutionary selection pressures. Now, because helping others is costly, generally, we need others to reciprocate. Survival depended on trust and cooperation between people, so what developed over evolutionary time is advanced cheater detection mechanisms. Humans are extremely sensitive to unfairness, freeloading, and dishonesty. The resulting outrage and punishment protect the group from freeloaders, making cooperation more stable. The costs of punishment, loss of status, even physical retaliation increased the selection pressures towards altruism. So, it came to be that good moral behaviour boosts status. Generosity, honesty and loyalty make others want to align with us. And in ancestral settings, these character traits, being seen as trustworthy, could literally mean the difference between survival and extinction. And here's the crux of this. We all have within us a perpetual tension between self-interest and altruism. These are hardwired, conflicting drives within us all. And personality and environmental pressures may predispose each of us to favour one or other of these two deep moral positions across time and across situations. So we're not purely altruistic. Self-interest and group interest often collide. For example, we may be generous in public, but actually selfish in private. So much of morality is about managing this tension, and flourishing is about managing this tension wisely. Also, of course, our moral intuitions are not always wise. We're often self-deceived, hiding from ourselves our selfishness or our faults. In addition, our moral intuitions can be gamed or overwhelmed by environments that they were not designed for. We're very deeply wired for resentment, moral outrage, and over-identification with in-groups versus out-groups. We often overreact as our evolutionary heritage predisposes us to view deception and cheating from an existential perspective. It's life and death. This latter fact is the reason we need social mores, laws, institutions, and ethical frameworks to offset the limitations of our moral intuitions, designed as they were for small groups in our ancestral environments where cooperation equaled survival. All this provides a useful perspective on current social and political polarisation, which naturally forms when people and practices inflame our collective moral outrage. Anyway, where should we start with our character development? Well, a good place to start is with our personality. As we saw in the earlier podcasts, we ought to notice where and why we suffer as a result of our personality preferences not helping us to flourish. No one is born with a personality that's perfectly adaptive to their ever-changing environment. We need to work, as long as we're alive, on recalibrating, on building our character. This is a practice. We have to repeat these practices until they become deep habits wired into our nervous system. In this sense, we become what we do. For example, I often think of therapeutic progress as character development. Whether it's utilising existing character strengths or remediating character deficiencies such as cowardice, dishonesty, or selfishness, as we learn more about ourselves and our impact on others, we can opt for wiser action and wiser understanding. And by wiser, I mean action and understanding that lead to well-being for self and others. So, in terms of personality, it could begin by recognising that if I am naturally prone to anxiety, I might be consistently overestimating the danger of situations and actually avoiding opportunities that would increase my well-being. Alternatively, it could be that my emotions are too stable. I'm experienced as cold and android-like by others. So I might end up lacking in intimate connection. For such personality extremes, the therapeutic strategy is always to recalibrate towards the mean, towards more objective and more socially constructive living. So the anxious person might use cognitive restructuring to reduce the perceived danger of everyday situations. They may also practice mindfulness or breathing exercises or any other way to reliably decrease their nervous system's overactivation. Conversely, the overly emotionally stable person probably needs to become more familiar with their own emotions and those of others. In building their emotional intelligence, they need to deliberately listen to other people's feelings and accord them value. And they can practice expressing positive emotions unambiguously to others, and so on. This view about the relationship between character and personality also provides a perspective on destructive personality disorders such as narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sociopathy. Such dark triad personality disorders are excellent examples of freeloading or cheating, where the person weighs the balance very heavily to self-interest rather than reciprocal altruism. Now, what makes full-blown dark triad personality disorders so unnerving and so triggering is that people with these personalities don't feel the normal evolutionary pressure towards altruistic feeling, and they don't feel guilty about that. This is discombobulating for most of us. It's shocking, and it's perhaps not recognised because it just seems unbelievable. Thus, we are easily gaslit by these people. In technical terms, what most people would find distasteful in self and therefore feel guilty about, these nasty types actually value in themselves. For most of us, these values of deception, win-lose, and even cruelty would be ego dystonic. They would make us feel uncomfortable about ourselves with feelings of guilt and shame, even self-loathing. For those who are sociopathic, Machiavellian, and narcissistic, they're proud of their values. It's ego syntonic. It feels smart, right, or natural. Here again, we see how the egocentric bias can trap us all. We naturally believe our perspective is right, and of course, others' different perspectives are wrong. We see with all these examples that values are somewhat built into our personality predispositions. The anxious person overvalues safety. The overly emotionally stable person values non-emotionality. The sociopath positively values their cruelty and their callousness. The narcissist believes their self-adulation and thinks it's a great thing. The Machiavellian believes manipulation is smart and to be admired. They may disguise it because they know that most people disagree. This is also what makes change for them so difficult. They're not motivated to change. Their character development is stalled at the get-go because they see no need for it. Fortunately, most of us are not as strongly biased in this way. Our biases are less extreme and more amenable to feedback, as we really, really value other people's respect and esteem for us. Our moral intuition is that the most important thing is our positive social connection. The Harvard Life Satisfaction Study, also known as the Harvard Study of Adult Development, strongly supports this concern for intimate relationships and strong social connections. This 85-year-long study reveals that positive relationships are, by far, the most crucial factor for happiness, health, longevity, far more so than money or career. The study emphasises the importance of social fitness, or actively nurturing relationships, and highlights its quality, not quantity, that really matters. So we've come full circle, but now to recalibrating our personality preferences towards a different purpose. Not so much about passing on our genes, but towards flourishing. It turns out the most important environment we need to adapt to is the social environment, that is, to other people. Study after study indicate that character strengths such as kindness, compassion, and honesty are good for both giver and receiver. They constitute win-wins and are at the core of any workable morality. Accordingly, building a good character is, I think, our most important life task. That is, of course, if your priority is a life of satisfaction and well-being. And with that profundity, I conclude this podcast. As always, take it easy, and I'll catch you next time. You've been listening to the Psychology to Live By podcast. If you like the podcast and want to know more, my website is www.drchris.life. There you'll find links to my various social media posts, a newsletter, and lots more. And share the podcast with people you like so they can like it too.